Hi. So following on from our webinar last week about radiation safety, I thought we'd sort of tie a few of the major points that came up together. And one of the points that was brought up a number of times, both in the questions and answers and also in the speakers' presentations, was the ALARA principle, which is the as low as reasonably achievable principle. The principles of ALARA then were discussed, which are time, distance, and shielding. So, I mean, again, anyone who's got this far into the video will know them, but essentially you want to have anyone working with the radiation in the environment for as least time as possible. You want them to be as far away from the source as possible, and you want them to have shielding in between them. So that's the whole time distance shielding principle. But when we really look into it, especially in the cath lab or the interventional suite, there's not much we can do in the current environment with our current technology to improve that. Time, that's where you need the training, because if you've got a surgeon, if you've got a cardiologist, a radiologist, or a radiographer who hasn't got up-to-date training, they can have what Shauna mentioned in the webinar as the heavy foot syndrome, which just means on the foot pedal, they're using too much radiation. So essentially, as soon as the surgeon's eyes leave the screen, there shouldn't be any radiation in the room. That's something that needs constant reminding, because the surgeon or the radiologist who's doing this has 500 other things going on in their head at the time, and radiation might not be at the forefront of their mind. So we talk about things like time being really important in the radiation safety lessons that we've put out, but then we go into a lot more detail about that. And it's like, if you're using 10 seconds of radiation screening, maybe you've only got to use the first couple of seconds as a diagnostic image. So you're looking for a guide wire, for example. Once you've found the guide wire, you can reduce the frame rate, you can reduce the dose to then follow it around the arch of the aorta or something like that. So, or you can reduce collimation. So these are sort of extra things apart from the time distance shielding. The shielding, there's a lesson in there about being behind lead glass shielding. There's some lessons about having your radiation safety glasses on, and these come with the data that then shows you such a huge drop, like 100 times less radiation to the lens of your eyes when you've got your radiation glasses on. So really, that shouldn't need reminding every year, but oddly it does. So if you've got to go through this little bit of training every year and you get a much lower dose to your eyes, I think people will accept that. So there was lots of those things that came up, and I think anyone who's been using our radiation safety software will appreciate the 8 practical lessons in there. Another thing we touched on briefly is why radiation safety training is so hard to teach. And it's sort of an obvious answer in that radiation is invisible, so you can point out what's going on in the room, you can explain the physics behind it, but people get laissez-faire about the whole process, especially when people sort of say, I'm going to be in here really quickly, and you're like, well, it doesn't matter how quick you are, you can't come in. But if the radiation was spread around the room like paint, which it is in a virtual reality environment, people wouldn't go in. People would just say, well, it's completely unacceptable for me to go in there without the protective equipment on. And so that's what we've done. We've given accurate data for everyone who's in the room based on their wrist, so they can have a look down and see their wrist at any point in time. But we also record the data of their eye, chest, and pelvis. We chose them for 3 very radio-sensitive areas. The other reason it's so hard to teach is because a lot of what we say in radiation safety doesn't make a lot of sense unless you get quite into it. And again, I go back to the cardiologist or the surgeon, the theatre nurses. They've got so much other stuff to be thinking about and to be doing in their role that we expect them to be on top of their radiation, but actually they're doing so much other stuff. They think radiation is a side issue. But if we take it back a level, and we even talk about the shielding again, an anaesthetist in the room might be actually getting quite a dose of radiation, depending on the operation, depending on where they've got to stand or sit. And the whole thing about distance comes up. But realistically, if you could remove yourself from the room, your distance would be great, and this whole conversation becomes an academic discussion. But really what we've tried to show in our lessons is what happens when you've got to be in the room and you've got to be doing your job. So say, for example, a theatre nurse has to be by the pelvis area of the patient to be involved with the, putting needles in, and you say, okay, well, they can't move to the other side of the room just because you're doing radiation. But what they might be able to do is take a step to the other side of their surgical trolley, which we've shown in our simulation can reduce their pelvic dose and their chest dose to some extent by 30 to 40%. The anaesthetist, again, might see the tubes going into like a steep angle position and think, I now recognize these areas, I've seen what it does in a training environment, so I'm going to move to the other side of my anesthetic machine, which is a large metal block, essentially, and they'll get a much lower dose. So it's about training in a really practical sense rather than saying, well, you've got to have distance. Well, everyone, if they wanted distance, could just leave the room, but then we've got a situation where the operation isn't being done. So apart from the legal and moral responsibility that a healthcare organisation has to be aware of when they're designing training or getting training for their staff in the operating theatres. There's also the financial and the insurance, well, the insurance is a financial, but the financial and the regulatory risk that they're exposing themselves to if they don't. There are certain fines that a hospital can receive if they don't adequately train their staff. There's the Occupational Safety and Health Authority, and insurance costs can go up. Those are the sort of the medium ones. The higher level ones are if a staff member was to turn around and sue them at the end of a reasonably long career for coming up with negative effects of negative effects of radiation exposure during their career, such as cancer. So there's a lot to think about. There's a lot to dig in. We really have seen a large uptake over in certainly the last year, but to a lesser extent the last few years, about radiation safety training, and I think this is going to be something we're going to continue to hear about over the next few years until it's reached an adequate level.
For better education.